Her son's fist connected before she even saw it coming. 63-year-old Vivian Marsh didn't scream. She didn't call 911. She wiped the blood from her lip, and by morning, she'd done something far more dangerous than crying for help. She'd made a phone call that would end her son's life as he knew it. What she did next wasn't revenge. It was a reckoning 3 decades in the making. Before we go into the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Vivian Marsh had lived in the same brick house on Freedom Row in Savannah, Georgia, for 31 years. She had raised 2 children in that house, buried a husband from that house, and built a quiet, orderly life within its walls that she had never once expected to feel unsafe in. Her son, Marcus, 36, had moved back in 18 months ago after his construction business collapsed under the weight of 2 defaulted contracts and a business partner who had disappeared with the operating capital. Vivian had welcomed him without hesitation, the way mothers do, clearing out his old bedroom, cooking his favorite meals, telling herself this was temporary, a soft place for her son to land while he rebuilt. What she hadn't expected was the temper. It started small, the way these things always start small. A raised voice over a misplaced set of keys, a slammed cabinet door after a phone call with a supplier who wouldn't extend credit, a tightness around his eyes when she asked, gently, how the job search was going. She told herself it was stress. She told herself a man who had lost everything he'd built was entitled to some frustration, some rough edges, as long as it stayed contained to raised voices and slammed doors. Last night it stopped staying contained. One closed fist, one shattered assumption about who her son had become, and Vivian standing alone in her kitchen tasting copper, understanding in that instant that 18 months of small warnings had just arrived at their true conclusion. He'd left without apologizing. The truck peeling out of the driveway toward whatever bar or friend's couch he retreated to when shame chased him out of a room. Vivian stood at the counter for a long time after the sound of the engine faded, pressing a dish towel to her lip, and then she did something that surprised even her. She didn't cry. She walked to the small desk in the corner of her bedroom, the one that had been her husband's, and she opened the bottom drawer where she kept her financial paperwork, because some instinct she couldn't yet name was telling her that last night's violence hadn't come from nowhere. It had come from somewhere specific, and she intended to find out where. She spent the next 2 hours at that desk with a cup of chamomile tea going cold beside her, pulling bank statements from the drawer and laying them out in chronological order across the quilt, the way she used to organize lesson plans back when she taught 3rd grade. She had noticed small discrepancies before, 6 weeks ago if she was honest with herself, amounts that didn't quite match what she remembered spending, but she had explained them away the same way she'd explained away the slammed doors. Now, in the lamplight at 1 in the morning with a healing cut at the corner of her mouth, she stopped explaining. She started counting. For $1,000 in March, $6,200 in April. The pattern repeated almost every month, always within a few days of her pension deposit clearing, always transferred to an account she didn't recognize by name, but recognized immediately once she looked closer. It was Marcus's business account, the one he'd told her, as recently as 2 weeks ago, was steady and recovering. By 2 in the morning, Vivian had a number. $61,000, drawn down in careful increments over 18 months, small enough each time that she had never once looked closely enough to add them together. She sat very still on the edge of her bed for a long moment after she finished the total, and something in her chest that had been braced for grief instead settled into something harder and clearer. She was not going to spend the rest of her retirement being quietly robbed by a son she had raised to know better. She picked up her phone and, for the first time that night, did not hesitate. Her first call was to Reginald Cole, 65, her late husband's business partner of 20 years, a man who had built half the black-owned commercial properties on that side of Savannah and who had known Marcus since he was a boy scraping his knees on the sidewalk outside Reginald's old hardware store. She told him what had happened in careful, measured sentences, the hit first, then the money, because she wanted him to understand this wasn't only about a bruise. Reginald was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then he said, "I'll be there at 7, Vivian. Don't clean anything up before then. Not the kitchen, not your face, not the story." She understood exactly what he meant. He wanted Marcus to see, unfiltered, exactly what his hands had done. Her second call was to her daughter, Simone, 33, an attorney in Atlanta who had built her career on exactly the kind of careful documentation her mother had just spent the last 2 hours assembling. Vivian said only 4 words. "Come home. Bring documents." Simone did not ask for elaboration over the phone. She had grown up watching her mother handle crises with this same economical calm, and she trusted that whatever waited for her in Savannah was serious enough not to need explaining twice. She was in her car within 20 minutes, a legal pad and a portable printer in her back seat, driving the 4 hours through the dark with the radio off, running through in her head every version of what her brother might have done. Vivian did not sleep. She spent the remaining hours before dawn doing what she had always done when the world felt unsteady beneath her. She cooked, not out of any illusion that food would soften what was coming, but because her hands needed something to do besides shake, and because there was a version of this morning where breakfast on the table would function exactly the way she intended it to, a demonstration that she was not afraid, that she had not spent the night curled up in fear waiting for her son to decide whether he was sorry. She made grits from scratch, the way her own mother had taught her in a kitchen 2 counties over, and scrambled eggs, and thick-cut bacon, and she set her dining room not with delicate care, but with the deliberate precision of a woman staging a room for exactly the conversation she intended to have in it. At 6:15, headlights swept across the front windows, and Reginald Cole came up the porch steps in a gray blazer, hat in hand, his face tightening almost imperceptibly when he saw the bruise blooming along Vivian's jaw in the kitchen light. He didn't comment on it directly. He simply took her hand for a moment, the way he had at her husband's funeral 6 years earlier, and said, "Show me where you want me." She pointed to the head of the table, the seat that had been her husband's, and Reginald settled into it without hesitation, understanding, the way Sheriff Boyd once had in an earlier version of this same kind of morning, that the seat itself was part of the message. Simone arrived 20 minutes later, tires crunching gravel in the driveway, and came through the front door already pulling a folder from her bag, dark circles under her eyes from the drive, but her expression sharp and focused. She hugged her mother briefly, carefully, mindful of the bruise, and then set to work at the dining table, spreading the printed bank statements into an organized sequence, highlighting the recurring transfers in yellow, building the same case she might have built for a courtroom. Except the only audience that mattered this morning was walking down the stairs in a few hours with no idea what waited for him. Marcus came downstairs at 7:40, later than usual, his footsteps heavy with the particular fatigue of a man who had spent the night nursing both a hangover and a guilty conscience he hadn't yet decided how to handle. He smelled the bacon before he reached the bottom of the stairs and felt, for just a moment, a flicker of the old relief that used to come from his mother's cooking, the assumption, built over 36 years, that whatever had gone wrong the night before could be smoothed over by morning. He rounded the corner into the dining room, already reaching for an easy smile. And then he stopped completely, his hand still on the doorframe, because the room in front of him was not the room he expected. Reginald Cole sat at the head of the table in his father's old chair, still and watchful. Simone sat beside him with a folder open and a legal pad covered in her small, precise handwriting. And his mother sat facing the doorway directly, the bruise at her jaw no longer hidden by anything, her eyes fixed on him with an expression he had never once seen from her in 36 years, not fear, not disappointment even, but something closer to finished patience. "Sit down, Marcus," Reginald said, his voice level. "We need to talk about the money, and then we need to talk about your hands." Marcus's mouth opened, and nothing came out. He looked at the folder, at his mother's face, at Reginald's steady eyes, and understood in the space of a single held breath that whatever excuse had gotten him through the last 18 months of quiet withdrawals and last night's violence was not going to survive contact with this room. He sat down slowly, the chair scraping against the hardwood, and Simone slid the folder toward him without a word. He opened it and saw his own failed business account laid bare across a dozen printed pages, transfer after transfer highlighted in yellow, his mother's retirement account draining in a pattern too consistent to be anything but deliberate. "I noticed 6 weeks ago," Vivian said, and her voice did not shake. "I told myself I was wrong. I told myself you would never. I gave you 18 months of never, Marcus, and last night I finally asked you where $61,000 of my retirement had gone, and instead of answering me, You hit me hard enough to split my lip. Marcus stared at the numbers, at the total circled in red at the bottom of the last page, and something in his shoulders began to cave inward, the posture of a man watching the last available exit close in front of him. I was going to pay it back, he said, the same sentence he had rehearsed in his head 100 times over 18 months without ever quite believing it himself. The contracts were coming. I just needed a little more time. Simone cut him off, her voice calm but immovable. She's 63. She needs that money now, not on your timeline. That's what retirement is supposed to mean. The waiting is supposed to be over. Marcus looked at his sister, seeing her clearly, perhaps for the first time in years, not as the little sister who used to trail him around their childhood yard, but as a woman who had built an entire career on precisely this kind of accountability and had no intention of softening it for family. Reginald leaned forward, his hands folded exactly the way Marcus's father used to fold his during business meetings at this same table decades earlier. Your father built 3 buildings on this block with his own 2 hands, he said. He would want to know why his son thought it was acceptable to build his own comfort on top of his mother's savings, and then raise a fist when she finally had the nerve to ask why. The words landed harder than anything Vivian had said, precisely because they came from a man who had known Marcus his entire life and had never once, until this morning, needed to speak to him this way. Marcus's hands were shaking now, flat against the folder, his breath coming faster. I don't know how to fix this, he said. And for the first time since sitting down, the sentence carried no performance in it at all, only the raw admission of a man who had run out of ways to explain himself. Vivian reached for her coffee cup, her hand steady in a way it had not been the night before, and studied her son for a long moment before she spoke again. You don't fix it in one morning, she said. You fix it by showing up the same way every single day for a long time, the way I showed up for you for 36 years without once asking for collateral. She laid out the terms then, one by one, her voice never rising. Reginald would serve as trustee over what remained of her accounts effective immediately, so that no further transfer could happen without a second signature. Simone had already drafted a formal repayment agreement, structured with interest the way any bank would structure it, because in this specific matter, Marcus was not her son. He was a debtor, and debtors did not get family discounts. And the assault, because that was the word Vivian used, deliberately, watching him flinch at the precision of it, would be addressed separately through a men's accountability program Reginald had already contacted on her behalf, a real structured program, not casual conversation. Marcus would attend, or he would no longer live under her roof, and given everything laid out on the table in front of him, he no longer had any argument for why that roof was owed to him. Marcus sat with his head in his hands for a long moment, his shoulders shaking silently before the sound finally broke through, a grown man crying at his mother's dining table in front of the people who had known him his whole life. I don't know when I became someone who could do that to you, he said, and Vivian let the silence hold for a moment before she answered, because some sentences needed room around them before a response could mean anything. I don't either, she said finally. But I know who you're going to become instead, because I am not going to let you become anyone else. Not while I'm still breathing and still capable of setting a table like this one. Simone slid the first page of the repayment agreement across the table, a pen resting on top of it, and Marcus looked at it for a long moment before picking it up. The sound of the pen against paper was the only sound in the room besides the clock on the wall, and when he finished signing, he looked up at his mother properly for the first time since walking in, really looking at the bruise along her jaw, seeing it now not as evidence laid out for a case, but as something he had actually done to the woman who raised him. I'm sorry, he said, and this time the words carried weight they had never carried in any of his previous apologies. I hear you, Vivian said. Now show me. Not today. Every day after today. Reginald gathered his hat and told Vivian quietly, before he left, that he would stop by every week to review the account statements with her, not because he doubted her judgment, but because no woman should have to carry that kind of vigilance entirely alone. Simone stayed through the afternoon, walking her mother through every clause of the trustee paperwork until every safeguard was airtight, before finally driving back to Atlanta as the evening light turned gold over the highway. Marcus spent the day quiet and useful, moving his belongings out of his childhood bedroom and into the garage apartment out back, an arrangement his mother had proposed herself. close enough that she could still watch over him, far enough that the boundary meant something real. 2 weeks later, Marcus attended his first accountability group session at the community center on Waters Avenue, sitting in a circle of folding chairs among men he didn't know, saying almost nothing the entire first meeting except his name. He kept attending anyway, every Tuesday evening, because his mother had made it a condition of everything else, and because some quiet, unfamiliar part of him had started to want it for reasons that had nothing to do with the conditions at all. He made his first payment against the repayment agreement at the end of that same month, smaller than the total owed by a wide margin, but real, and Vivian deposited the check without comment, understanding that the size of the payment mattered less than the fact that it had come at all, on time, without her having to ask. By early autumn, something had settled into the house on Freedom Row that hadn't been there in 18 months. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but something steadier than the fragile peace that used to follow Marcus's outbursts. Vivian still locked her bedroom door out of habit some nights, and she still felt her shoulders tense slightly whenever his voice rose, even in ordinary conversation. But she no longer woke at 3 a.m. running numbers in her head, because Reginald's signature sat beside hers on every account now, and because her son was, slowly, becoming a man who called before he was late, instead of disappearing for hours the way he used to. One evening in October, Vivian sat on her porch as the Savannah light went gold and then gray, watching Marcus walk back from the garage apartment carrying a plate for dinner, the same plate he'd carried across that yard every evening for 2 months straight, without her having to ask. She thought about the morning she had set that table, the folder, the bruise, the way she had refused to let silence be the thing that protected him from consequences, and she understood, watching her son cross the yard in the fading light, that she had not been wrong to believe people could still change, only wrong to believe it would happen on its own, without a reckoning first. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. If Vivian's story moved you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We read every single one. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Last Page Stories. And give this video a like if you'd love to see more stories like this one. We'll see you in the next one.